He spent more than 3 years behind bars at the Baltimore City Detention Center, and gang leader Tavon White made it clear that the big house was his house. In his opening statement, a federal prosecutor quoted White from an intercepted cell phone call back in January of last year when he said, quote, "This is my jail. You understand that? I'm dead serious. I make every final call in the jail."
This is my jail. You understand that? I make every final call in this jail. Whatever I say is law. Those words belong to a man inside a cell, a man with no badge, no title, no authority the state of Maryland had ever given him. And yet, according to federal prosecutors, he ran the place. Baltimore, Maryland, a city that has always operated on two sets of rules. The ones written in statute and the ones that actually govern daily life on the ground. In that gap, certain men have always found room to rise. Tavon White was born into that city around 1978. On the streets, people knew him as Bulldog. The nickname fit, not because he was physically imposing, though accounts suggest he could be, but because of the way he held control, the grip, the refusal to let go. By the time he was 18, according to reporting, he had already been in and out of custody multiple times. His criminal record included a shooting. Court documents reference him shooting a fellow street-level drug dealer on 4 separate occasions. He was not a man who operated on the edges of his world, he was at the center of it. In the year 2000, according to his own federal plea agreement, Tavon White became a member of the Black Guerilla Family, the BGF. Who is the Black Guerilla Family? Founded in 1966 inside California's San Quentin State Prison, the BGF began as a politically charged organization with a black liberation ideology. Over the following decades, it evolved, and by the time Tavon White joined, its Maryland chapter had become something more pragmatic. A structured criminal enterprise with a clear chain of command, defined roles, and a footprint that stretched from the streets of Baltimore into the state's correctional system. The BGF had ranks, ministers, commanders, a hierarchy that could function whether its leaders were locked up or not, because for the BGF, a prison cell was not the end of operations. In many cases, it was the beginning. Drop this in the comments. Before this story, had you ever heard of the Black Guerilla Family? Most people haven't. And what happened next is why they should have. In 2009, Tavon White was taken into pretrial custody at the Baltimore City Detention Center, BCDC, on a charge of attempted second-degree murder. He was not convicted yet. He was waiting. And while he waited, according to federal prosecutors, he went to work. BCDC was not a maximum security prison. It was a detention center, a holding facility for people awaiting trial. The security culture, investigators would later argue, reflected that less rigorous than a state penitentiary, more routine, more porous. The BGF had already established a foothold inside BCDC before White arrived. But with White's arrival, investigators say the operation stopped being a foothold and became a full takeover. He came in already knowing the structure. He came in already respected, and within 2 years, he would be running it. According to his federal plea agreement, Tavon White first became lieutenant commander of the BGF inside BCDC. Then, in 2011, he was elevated to commander, the top of the BGF's internal chain of command within the jail system. That promotion mattered. As commander, he oversaw BGF operations not just inside BCDC itself, but across several connected facilities: the Baltimore Central Booking and Intake Center, the Women's Detention Center, and the Jail Industries Building. The government described what happened next in stark terms. Prosecutors said BCDC had become, and I am quoting from the federal indictment announcement directly, an upside-down world where inmates ran the prison and correctional officers took directions from the gang leader. The BGF under White did not operate like a conventional gang. It operated like a company. It had a minister of finance, a minister of education, defined roles, disciplinary protocols, a leadership structure that, by almost any organizational measure, functioned. And at the top of that structure, one man in a cell with a contraband cell phone.
And today we're learning more about how he says he ran the jail. 11 News I-Team reporter Barry Sims joins us outside federal court now with the details. Barry?
Tavon White described how his organization, the Black Guerilla Family, continued to control contraband at the Baltimore City Detention Center, and he also began to tell how other alleged co-conspirators participated.
Every operation needs supply lines. White's was built on the one resource BCDC had that most prisons don't in the same way. A large number of relatively low-paid, regularly screened, but apparently not screened enough, civilian correctional officers passing through its gates every single day. According to court records, White directed his BGF network to recruit those officers as couriers. The contraband included cell phones, which were the nerve center of the entire operation, as well as tobacco, marijuana, and prescription pills. The methods of smuggling, as described in court documents and reported by NPR and CBS News, among others, were remarkably low-tech. Items hidden in hair, tucked into lunches, concealed in clothing, brought in on the body. Past checkpoints, past supervisors, past every layer of security the facility was supposed to have. The cell phones were the most valuable piece. With a phone, White could run his operation from inside a cell the same way any executive runs a company from an office. He could direct activity on the streets. He could coordinate contraband deliveries. He could communicate with co-conspirators on the outside who were holding and moving product on his behalf. And according to prosecutors, the money was real. $15,000 a month. From inside a jail cell. I want to know what you think about that. Drop it below. Are you more shocked by the money or by the fact that nobody stopped it for 4 years? Here is a detail that rarely makes the headlines, but matters enormously to understanding how this operation actually worked. The smuggling didn't begin at the jail door, it began outside. According to federal court documents, White and his closest BGF allies used people on the outside, co-defendants in the case, associates, and others, to acquire contraband, hold it, and then deliver it to correctional officers who would carry it in. The operation had an entire external logistics layer that existed solely to service the supply chain running into BCDC. Some of those outside participants were also named in the indictment. This was not a spontaneous arrangement between one inmate and one guard. This was, according to prosecutors, a coordinated criminal enterprise with moving parts on both sides of the walls. And at the center of every transaction, cash, gifts, or a share of the profits for the officers who cooperated. In some cases, prepaid debit cards, according to reporting, were used to transfer funds. A detail that speaks to the degree of planning and financial sophistication involved.
And what Assistant U.S. Attorney Robert Harding characterized as an upside-down world where inmates ran the jail, a pair of prisoners, along with 5 guards and a worker from the facility's kitchen, now face conspiracy charges involving racketeering, drug dealing, and money laundering. But attorneys for the accused told the jury that the government has built the bulk of its case against them around people who have accepted deals to avoid jail time.
Now we come to the part of this story that generated more headlines than any other. And I want to be careful here because the easy version of this story treats it like tabloid material. The real version is far more complicated. According to his federal plea agreement, Tavon White entered into personal relationships with 4 female correctional officers while incarcerated at BCDC. He fathered 5 children with those 4 women. 1 officer bore 2 of his children. When White took the stand during the subsequent trials of his co-defendants, he was asked about those relationships. He testified that the gang specifically identified female officers who appeared to have vulnerabilities. That targeting was intentional. This was a recruitment strategy built around identifying and exploiting human vulnerability.
Gang leader continued his testimony today in a federal jail corruption trial.
That leader, Tavon White, is the prosecution's key witness, and today we're learning more about how he says he ran the jail. 11 News I-Team reporter Barry Sims joins us outside federal court now with the details. Barry?
Tavon White described how his organization, the Black Guerilla Family, continue to control contraband at the Baltimore City Detention Center, and he also began to tell how other alleged co-conspirators participated. Jurors in the federal jail corruption trial heard more from the prosecution's key witness. Tavon White testified he was in control at the Baltimore City Detention Center and that his organization, the Black Guerilla Family, controlled the flow of cell phones, prescription drugs, marijuana, and other contraband. White also outlined how BGF conducted business inside and outside the jail. From contraband sales, he said he made $10,000 to $20,000 a month. Former corrections officer Ralph Johnson Jr. wrote a book about the jail. He is monitoring the trial.
Well, he seems pretty credible. That's jail culture. And he got caught up with a situation, and he's trying to save his neck, and he's giving up everybody else. This is the theme of jail life as we see it today.
Prosecutors are trying to show how corrections officers and 2 inmates were involved in the conspiracy. White testified to handle transactions, $500 or more would be placed on prepaid Green Dot cards. He said $10,000 in cash was given to an alleged co-conspirator, corrections officer Travis Paler, who was seen in the tan clothing. The money was for the purchase of prescription pain reliever Percocet. White claimed Paler was for a time an important supplier. Attorney Carmen Hernandez would not speak to reporters. She represents Michelle McNair. White identified McNair in court, saying she worked in the kitchen jail. He said she brought marijuana and tobacco and put it into his hands to give to another BGF member. He also claimed that corrections officers Clarissa Clayton and Sergeant Michelle Ricks also smuggled in contraband. Prosecutors played several recorded phone calls. In one, White claimed, "This is my jail. I make every final call in this jail." He also said, "Everything comes to me, everything. And they got to run it through me." White told jurors inmates who sold contraband needed permission from him. When asked if he was concerned about contraband being found in his cell, White said, "I always had somebody to hold it for me or places to put it." And he would, quote, "feed them," meaning he would give them marijuana or tobacco or allow them to make phone calls as payment.
You know, when it's time to save your neck, you're going to give up whoever you have to give up.
Now, White admitted to the jury that he had had sexual relationships with several of the corrections officers and that he had fathered children while in jail. Reporting live from downtown Baltimore, Barry Sims, WBAL-TV 11 News.
The indictment and subsequent guilty pleas named specific correctional officers. For this documentary, naming them is not about humiliation, it is about accountability. These were employees of the state of Maryland who made choices that ended their careers. Katara Stevenson. She pleaded guilty. She was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison. Stevenson had the name Tavon tattooed on her wrist, a fact cited in court documents and widely reported. She was one of the officers White fathered a child with. Jennifer Owens, named in the indictment, one of the officers charged in connection with the BGF smuggling conspiracy. And then there was the second tattoo. Another officer had White's name tattooed on her neck. In a facility where you are supposed to be the authority, she was wearing her allegiance to an inmate on her skin. These were not subtle signals. They were declarations. And for years, apparently, no one in a supervisory position asked the obvious question. The tattoos are the detail that hits differently every time I think about it. What does that say to you? About the power dynamic? About the institution? About human nature? Comment below. I read everyone. We're going to pause here for just a second. If knowing the actual facts matters to you, then hitting subscribe is the single best thing you can do to keep this channel going. Okay, back to Bulldog.
Defense is seeking answers in that city jail corruption trial. In a phone call from jail, Tavon White tells one of the mothers of his children, quote, "I'm the big fish they want to catch." White has admitted fathering 4 children with 4 correctional officers while in custody. 11 News I-Team reporter Barry Sims is at the federal courthouse downtown with more on the prosecution's key witness. Barry?
Well, Stan, we'll get to that in just a moment. First, we want to let you know that one juror was let go today because her child had a medical issue. Also today, Tavon White continued answering questions from the defense about deception and his cooperation with the government. Attorneys for the 8 alleged co-conspirators focused on Tavon White's credibility. They played a phone conversation recorded November 8th of this year at the Howard County Detention Center. In the call, White tells his grandmother that he was made to take a lie detector test because of questions about whether he was lying in some of the statements he gave federal investigators. And if he didn't cooperate and take a plea deal, he could end up with up to 45 years in jail for convictions on federal and state charges. White had already testified that he was the commander at the Baltimore City Detention Center and was in charge of a smuggling operation run by the Black Guerilla Family that brought in cell phones, tobacco, marijuana, and prescription drugs. White said he accepted the plea deal with the feds because my lawyer came to me and asked if I was willing to speak to them, and I said yes. When asked how long it took to decide, White said, "It took me maybe a minute." Focusing on having correctional officers smuggle contraband, White called them a means to an end, saying they did their job, but they were not used to maintain his control as commander, and that correctional officials were teaching new corrections officers about him at the academy. On his membership in the BGF, White answered correct when asked if he violated the organization's oath by testifying. He also said he never really cared about the philosophy, code, or oath of the BGF, saying, "At my heart, no." White's attorney, Gary Proctor, would not comment on his client's testimony, but he did tell us Mr. White would like to plead and walk off into the sunset. Now, White's federal plea deal in this racketeering and conspiracy case could get him a 12-year sentence in federal prison, and that could run concurrently with a 20-year state deal for an attempted murder charge.
In 2011, the state of Maryland quietly began building the mechanism that would eventually dismantle him. The Maryland Prison Task Force was assembled that year. For more than 2 years, they listened. They watched. The FBI's special agent in charge at the time, Stephen Vogt, later described what they found in terms that are worth pausing on. He said the investigation revealed that correctional officers were, in his words, in bed with BGF inmates, and that the detention centers had become, quote, safe havens for the gang. Law enforcement, he noted, should not have to concern itself with criminal subjects who have already been arrested. On April 2, 2013, a federal grand jury returned a racketeering indictment. It was sealed until April 23, when approximately 170 agents and officers executed 15 search warrants and made arrests across the network simultaneously. 25 defendants in the initial indictment. 13 of them were correctional officers. That was the opening move. The initial indictment was not the end. As investigators followed the evidence, the case expanded. Additional correctional officers were charged in subsequent indictments. By the time the full picture came into focus, 44 defendants total had been charged in the racketeering conspiracy. Among those 44, 24 correctional officers, sworn employees of Maryland. On August 6, 2013, Tavon White stood before a federal judge and entered a guilty plea to 1 count of racketeering conspiracy. He admitted in open court and in his plea agreement to directing the smuggling operation. He admitted to the personal relationships with 4 correctional officers. He admitted to fathering 5 children with those women. He admitted that outside co-conspirators helped run the supply chain. Of the 44 defendants charged, 35 pleaded guilty. 8 went to trial. 1 defendant died before the case was resolved. For the 8 who chose to fight the charges, the prosecution had a secret weapon, and that weapon was Tavon White himself. White spent 5 days on the witness stand, testifying against the remaining defendants. According to reporting from court coverage, he described the operation from the inside, how it worked, who participated, what the roles were, and why correctional officers chose to cooperate. His cooperation was extensive enough that prosecutors were able to add 19 additional names to the original indictment based on what he provided. At the sentencing in February 2015, Judge Ellen Hollander called White an excellent witness. The prosecution told the court that his decision to cooperate had taken great courage and assumed a lifelong risk. Think about what that means. The man who ran the jail from his cell had now spent 5 days inside a courtroom taking down the people who helped him do it. Whether you read that as cooperation, pragmatism, or a last act of survival instinct, the federal government accepted it, and they rewarded it. White cooperated fully and testified against everyone. Is that justice or just strategy? What do you think? Drop it below. This one usually starts a real conversation. Here is a counterintuitive detail. White had instituted a no-stabbing policy inside the facility. The argument, violence interfered with profits. This policy was presented as a mitigating factor in his sentencing. The judge noted it. White received credit for it. But let's hold that detail clearly. A gang commander issuing orders inside a government facility to reduce violence in order to protect a criminal smuggling operation was presented as a mitigating factor in federal sentencing. That sentence tells you everything you need to know about how far the dysfunction inside BCDC had gone. Before we get to the verdicts and the sentencing, I want to stop. Because in true crime content, it can be easy to lose the thread of what actually happened to real people. The correctional officers were not all calculating criminals. Some were young people targeted because they were seen as vulnerable. The integrity officers, the ones who showed up every day and did their jobs correctly, they have rarely been the subject of a headline. They deserve acknowledgement. And the children. 5 children born into this scandal. They did not choose any of this. They entered the world carrying weight that was never theirs. They deserve privacy. This story belongs to the families and communities in Baltimore, too. For the defendants who went to trial, the verdicts came in. 5 were convicted, 3 were acquitted. When the final numbers were tallied, 44 defendants charged, 40 convicted. It was one of the largest correctional corruption prosecutions in American history. On February 23, 2015, Judge Ellen Hollander sentenced Tavon White to 12 years in federal prison. Concurrently, he was serving a 20-year state sentence. Both sentences run at the same time, meaning the 12-year federal term effectively governs his release.
At the center of the city jail corruption scandal was sentenced to federal prison today as federal prosecutors and a judge heaped praise on him for turning on the gang that gave him his power.
Yeah, Tavon White became a key witness for the government, and it paid off today. 11 News 19 lead investigative reporter Jane Miller has that story from the federal courthouse.
The judge and prosecutors stopped short of calling Tavon White Man of the Year, but they agreed to chop off a significant chunk of his prison sentence, his reward for helping to convict 39 other people in the city jail scandal. Once the go-to man at Baltimore City Jail, Tavon White may be running for his life in the federal prison system. White was sentenced today to 12 years in federal prison for his role running the show at the city jail as an inmate, smuggling drugs and money, impregnating corrections officers, and calling the shots of what went on in the street, all as a leader of the Black Guerilla Family gang. But he could have gotten 20 years, the big reduction the result of White agreeing to plead guilty and cooperate as a key witness for prosecutors, who say he helped nail an additional 19 defendants, most of them corrections officers. White deserves credit, the federal prosecutor said in court today. It took great courage to do what he did. He's now a man in danger. Ralph Johnson, a former corrections officer turned author, says White got a huge break, but will need to look over his shoulder.
I think the government has to protect him. It's going to be very hard. The BGF is a national-wide organization, so to speak, and he crossed them. And when you cross who you're supposed to be loyal to, these are the things that happen no matter what level you're on.
White's lawyer says White decided to turn on the BGF gang when his brother was murdered soon after the jail scandal came to light. As for his future after he serves his time, his lawyer said even if he wanted to return to crime, who would want him back? White's federal sentence will run at the same time as a 20-year sentence he got in the state system for attempted murder. Given the chance today to say something in court, Tavon White declined. At the federal courthouse, I'm Jane Miller, WBAL TV 11 News.
For the Maryland Prison Task Force, the sentence was the capstone. But investigations continued, because corruption does not end with a conviction. It ends when the systems that allowed it are changed. The scandal forced a reckoning. Gary Maynard, the secretary of the system, resigned as a direct result. the state invested $4 million in technology to block unauthorized cell phone signals, addressing the single tool that made White's operation possible. Weekly searches were instituted, polygraph testing for staff was developed, and the Baltimore City Detention Center itself, the facility Tavon White had called his own, was eventually closed. An empty structure on the skyline, a monument to everything that went wrong. Whether the reforms were enough is a question that outlasts this case. If you ran a jail, what would you do differently to prevent exactly this? Think about it, and leave an answer below. We're almost at the end. If you watched this whole video, you're the kind of viewer this channel exists for. The best way to tell us that matters? Subscribe, share it with one person. Thank you. Now let's close this out. Tavon White's 12-year sentence, minus good time credit, places his approximate release window in the mid-2020s. We cannot confirm from public records whether he has been released. The correctional officers have served their sentences. The children are out in the world, growing up. They are not the story. The story is the system that allowed this to happen. The question of what it means when the people we put in charge of a building, who carry the authority of the state, can be recruited into the very thing they were hired to prevent. In a wiretapped call, Tavon White said 4 words that became the defining image of this case. "This is my jail." And for a while, according to 40 convictions, it was.